committee will come to order. We're meeting today to consider 5 bills, and due to the COVID-19 public health emergency, members can participate in today's markup either in person or remotely via online video conferencing. For members participating remotely, your microphones will be set on mute for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members participating remotely will need to unmute your microphone each time you wish to speak. And please note that once you unmute your microphone, anything that is said in Webex will be heard over the loudspeakers in the committee room and subject to be heard by the live stream and C-SPAN. Additionally, I ask that members participating remotely use the raise hand feature of the software platform when you wish to be recognized. During recorded votes, you will need to unmute yourself to respond to the clerk once your name is called. In responding to the clerk, I ask that instead of just saying aye or no, that you respond with a phrase like, Frank Pallone from New Jersey votes aye. This will provide additional time for the voting member to be identified and made visible on the platform. Now, since members are participating from different locations at today's markup, all recognition of members will be in the order of full committee seniority. During this markup, amendments will be sent to members electronically. Members participating in person should not bring paper copies of their amendments to the clerk's desk. If a member participating in person would like a paper copy of an amendment or bill, please alert the staff during the consideration of the amendment or bill. Amendments and motions should be sent to Chloe Rodriguez and Perry Hamilton, and documents for the record to Kalia Rogers at the email addresses we provided to staff. So I'm now going to recognize myself for an opening statement for 3 minutes. And again, say that today the committee is marking up 5 bipartisan bills. We'll begin by considering 4 bills out of our Communications and Technology Subcommittee. First, the Spectrum Innovation Act will help expedite the process for freeing up airwaves in the lower gigahertz band for commercial wireless use. It also establishes a process for the Secretary of Commerce to identify at least 200 megahertz in the band for exclusive or shared use and requires an auction of these airwaves within 7 years. An aims offered by Ranking Member Latta and Chairman Doyle today will add H.R. 7783, the bipartisan Extending America's Spectrum Auction Leadership Act, which provides the FCC with the necessary authority to auction valuable airwaves. The aims also includes the text of H.R. 5486, the SMART Act. This bill provides NTIA with the authority and resources it needs to design innovative technologies to help meet our nation's future spectrum demands. This aims, along with H.R. 4990, the ITS Codification Act, or ITS, I should say, the ITS Codification Act, which we're also considering today, reaffirms once again that NTIA is the agency that should lead the charge in both overseeing our federal airwaves and ensuring their efficient use. I'm also pleased that the amendment establishes that future auction proceeds not already accounted for must be used to help fund 2 important public initiatives: the FCC's RIP and Replace program and the Transition and Next Generation 911 networks. Collectively, these 2 programs will help keep all Americans safer and more secure. We'll also consider H.R. 4275, the Ensuring Phone and Internet Access Through Lifeline and Affordable Connectivity Program Act, which seeks to reduce the barriers that consumers can face when trying to enroll in federal programs to obtain voice and Internet services. And then H.R. 7132, the Safe Connections Act, which will help protect survivors of domestic violence, human trafficking, and other related crimes by requiring mobile providers to separate a survivor's phone line from an account shared with their abuser. And finally, we'll consider H.R. 3630. This is the health bill, the Lymphedema Treatment Act. And this important bill will provide Medicare coverage of compression garments for individuals with lymphedema, a chronic condition commonly caused by cancer treatments that remove or damage lymph nodes. While there is no cure, the use of compression garments can significantly improve outcomes and reduce the risk of infections and costly hospitalization. This bill will ensure that Medicare beneficiaries with lymphedema have access to the full range of treatments they need. So I look forward to advancing all 5 of these bipartisan bills today, and now we yield to our Ranking Member Rogers for her opening remarks.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we are considering 5 bills with bipartisan support. I want to thank my colleagues on this subcommittee for working diligently with us to prepare these bills for markup. And I want to thank my colleagues on several different aspects, Mr. Doyle and Mr. Latta for their leadership on the Spectrum Innovation Act of 2022, by authorizing the auction of the lower 3 gigahertz band. This bill can direct funding to enhance the security of our communications networks, strengthen our public safety resources, and unleash innovation. I'd like to give a special thanks to Mr. Hudson and Ms. Eshu, who have worked for several years to create a program that upgrades our nation's aging 911 infrastructure to the 21st century. In addition, this legislation provides funding to small communication carriers to secure their networks to protect American security, and extends the FCC's spectrum auction authority by 18 months, which will help them continue their work to make spectrum resources available, specifically the 2.5 gigahertz band. We also include Mr. Guthrie's Smart Spectrum Act, plays a key role in advancing the future of spectrum management and innovation. And the best part is that it won't cost the taxpayers a cent. We will fund these important congressional priorities through spectrum auction proceeds. In addition, we will be reviewing the Institute for Telecommunication Sciences, ITS, Codification Act. I'd like to thank my colleague, Mr. Buddy Carter, for his leadership on this bill, which codifies ITS and directs NTIA to support the development of emergency communication and tracking technologies. Finally, the Lymphedema Treatment Act is on today's agenda, which clarifies the scope of coverage and payment for lymphedema treatment items under the Medicare program. This important legislation is led by Ms. Shirkowski and Mr. Carter, and I look forward to working with them to review opportunities to ensure the bill's new spending is offset before floor consideration. As we all know, this committee has a rich history of bipartisanship on some of the most important issues that are pressing to our nation, and I just applaud the work that's been done across the board by the members of this committee, appreciate the leadership of the chairman in bringing these bills forward and continuing the rich tradition of this committee leading and getting things done. Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the ranking member and now recognize Ms. Eshu, Chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Health, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're marking up 5 bipartisan bills, which is always very good. First is the Lymphedema Treatment Act, which is sponsored by our colleague, Jan Schakowsky, that has 353 co-sponsors. Bravo to you, Jan. This is obviously one of the most popular bills in the House. Up to 10 million Americans live with debilitating lymphedema. There's no cure for it, but it can be effectively treated. Unfortunately, many insurers, including Medicare, don't cover doctor-prescribed compression supplies for treating the swelling that's caused by the disease. So this bill will change that oversight so that Medicare beneficiaries can get the medically necessary care they need. Our colleague has been working on this bill for over 12 years. I think we all know that tenacity really matters around here, and I'm so pleased that it's finally moving forward today. I'm also glad that today's markup includes legislation I introduced with Congresswoman Custer, the Safe Connections Act, to ensure that survivors of domestic violence can safely access vital communication tools. The bill tackles digital abuse by ensuring that shared phone plans don't pose an additional barrier for survivors to leave an abusive relationship, and it expands eligibility for free and low-cost connectivity services. Finally, the Spectrum Innovation Act includes an updated version of legislation I introduced to establish a new federal grant program to help the nationwide adoption of Next Generation 911. Next Gen 911 will bring our nation's 911 services into the 21st century, making our emergency communication centers more secure, more resilient, interoperable, and reliable. And all of that will help to save lives. Anytime I use the word interoperable or interoperability, I think of the firefighters and the police officers going into the Twin Towers, and there was no interoperability. It's haunting to me to think that if there were, what would the outcome have been instead? So I look forward to seeing these bills become law, and I yield back.
I thank Chairwoman Eshoo, and now we go to Ranking Member Guthrie for 3 minutes.
I don't have an opening statement.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, you want, okay, well, ask Mr. Latta to go next.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's markup. We're here to consider 4 bipartisan bills from the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology. Today's legislation provides certainty to the government's management of our nation's airways. Effective spectrum use allows the government to auction spectrum bands historically benefiting Americans by bringing in billions of dollars to the Treasury, reducing our national deficit, and allowing us to fund important congressional priorities. The legislation will provide certainty to the auction of the lower 3 gigahertz band, as well as the upcoming auction of the 2.5 gigahertz band by extending the FCC Spectrum Auction Authority for 18 months. The proceeds from these auctions will fund national priorities to secure our communications networks by funding the shortfall in the Secure and Trusted Communications Networks Reimbursement Program, advancing Next Generation 911, and using future auction proceeds to fund Mr. Guthrie's Smart Spectrum Act, which requires NTIA to establish and expand its spectrum management tools to promote United States wireless leadership. I want to thank my friend, Chairman Doyle, for his partnership in this effort. We will continue to make any necessary changes to this legislation to ensure it is budget neutral when it is considered on the floor. I'm also pleased to consider the rest of the legislation on today's markup that will be, among other things, provide Congress with necessary FCC data to inform our nation or our decision making, strengthen the role of NTIA's Institute of Telecommunication Sciences, and provide domestic violence survivors with a means of separating their mobile phone lines from their abuser in the case of shared service plans. Again, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Doyle, for being willing to willing negotiating partners on these topics. I look forward to moving these bills to the floor. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ranking Member Latta. Mr. Doyle has also waived. So do we have other members that seek recognition and make an opening statement? Is that Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank our ranking member. Thank you for bringing up this slate of bills for discussion today. I'd like to express my support for H.R. 3630, the Spectrum Innovation Act of 2022, because it's more important than ever to expand broadband availability across the nation, and greater access to critical mid-band spectrum will enable the deployment of next-generation telecommunication networks that can help us to get closer to closing the digital divide. Further, it is imperative to free up mid-band spectrum in order to facilitate the development of next-generation communication technologies, which will in turn create more jobs and opportunities for economic growth. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. Do we have anybody on the Republican side? Any other Democrat that wants to make an opening, virtual or otherwise? All right, then we're going to move to the, well, let me just say that pursuant to committee rules, members' written opening statements will also be made part of the record. So if you want to make an opening statement in writing, send it to the email address that we provided. So now we'll start with the first of the Communications Subcommittee bills. At this time, we'll consider, or I'll call up H.R. 7624, the Spectrum Innovation Act of 2022, and the clerk will report the title of the bill.
Committee print to H.R. 7624.
And Madam Clerk, without objection, the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment. Are there any members seeking recognition to speak on H.R. 7624?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Latta is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an Ains at the desk.
Does anyone want to speak on the bill? Otherwise, we'll move to the Ains. All right. Mr. Latta is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank you.
Well, I apologize.
sorry. I'm sorry, Mr.
Mr.
Chairman.
Latta, the clerk has to report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to the committee print for HR 7624 offered by Mr.
All right, so
Latta.
without objection, the reading of the amendment or the aims will be dispensed with, and Mr. Latta is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you, Chairman Doyle, and Mr. Guthrie for working with me over the last month to make further changes to the Spectrum Innovation Act. We must extend the FCC's auction authority, and I appreciate you bringing up this legislation for consideration. The Spectrum Innovation Act provides clarity and direction to NTIA to repurpose the lower 3 gigahertz spectrum, which was mandated in the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act. At the subcommittee markup, I offered an amendment to use future auction proceeds to direct proceeds from this auction to fund the FCC's Secure Networks Reimbursement Program and Next Generation 911. Congress directed communications providers to remove Huawei, ZTE, and other untrusted equipment from their networks. The initial cost estimate was $3.4 billion short, and this legislation will fill that gap. Additionally, we included Mr. Hudson and Ms. Eshu's bipartisan legislation to advance Next Generation 911 and provide up to $10 billion of future spectrum auction proceeds to facilitate this nationwide transition. Today, my amendment incorporates Mr. Guthrie's Smart Spectrum Act and use future auction proceeds to offset the cost of establishing an incumbent informing capability at NTIA. This tool will help bolster NTIA's ability to manage federal use of spectrum as well as identify new opportunities to make more spectrum available for commercial use. I'd like to thank Mr. Guthrie and Ms. Matsui for their leadership on this issue. The amendment also includes the Extending America's Spectrum Auction Leadership Act of 2022 legislation led by on the committee by Mr. Joyce, Mr. Welsh, and Mr. Johnson. This bipartisan amendment to extend the FCC's auction authority for 18 months will give the FCC the tools it needs to boost 5G and wireless broadband services in rural areas by making more mid-band spectrum available in the coming year. We must get this legislation swiftly signed into law. I look forward to working with my colleagues to move swiftly to get this legislation signed into law, and I yield back the balance of my, I yield to my good friend, Mr. Guthrie.
Thanks. I was going to claim time later, so I'll just do it now to save time for everyone, if I appreciate the gentleman yielding. And I support this legislation that extends the FCC's authority for 18 months, so the FCC can work beyond September. It will ensure more spectrum can be made available for both licensed and unlicensed uses 5G and other wireless technologies continue to play. It also is funding for the unmet needs for the RIP and Replace program, which Congress established to reimburse small providers for the replacement of untrusted equipment in their networks. And it's critical to protect us against China. And as my good friend mentioned, it includes the Smart Spectrum Act, which will require NTIA to establish an incumbent informing capability system to facilitate spectrum sharing between federal entities, as well as the sharing of spectrum between federal and non-federal users, and this would help mitigate harmful interference. I want to thank my good friend and caucus co-chair Doris Matsui for working with us. Chair Pallone, you and your staff, Ranking Member Morris Rogers, Chair Doyle, and Ranking Member Latta, I really appreciate the work to include my bill. And I will yield back to the Ranking Member of the subcommittee.
Would the member yield?
I yield.
I would also like to take this time to offer my support for H.R. 7624, the Spectrum Innovation Act, of which I am a co-sponsor. This bill is about ensuring communities throughout America to have fast and reliable broadband. And by reauthorizing the FCC Spectrum Auction Authority, we're creating new opportunities to allow for American industry to connect and our constituents who lack basic connectivity. We have all witnessed firsthand how the pandemic has impacted everyday Americans and their need for internet services. We need to create policies that work for people living in rural areas. I would like to thank my colleagues for their work in this bill, and I yield back.
I have 36 seconds left. Anybody else like the balance of my time? Hearing none, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Latta. Mr. Doyle?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This committee has a long tradition of working together on a bipartisan basis to ensure U.S. leadership and innovation in deploying advanced wireless technologies. And I'm proud that my good friend Representative Latta and I have continued in this tradition, leading to this bill and amendment being considered today. This bill creates a pathway for the Secretary of Commerce, the head of the agency that manages the federal use of our airwaves, to identify at least 200 megahertz of important mid-band spectrum for commercial wireless use, and also for the FCC to auction this spectrum within 7 years. In our markup at subcommittee, we amended the bill to direct that the proceeds from this auction will help fund critical national security and public safety priorities for this country. Both the RIP and Replace program and the Ng911 grant program will help keep countless communities across the country safer and more secure. And with this amendment offered by Representative Latta and me today, we incorporate the good work of Representatives Davis, Joyce, Welsh, and Johnson in finding a bipartisan path in H.R. 7783 to extend the FCC's general auction authority, which would have expired at the end of September. The AINS would direct the auction proceeds generated under this extension of authority towards funding these critical public safety programs too. What's more, we do all of this in a budget-neutral way by investing the new funds we raise in the security of our networks and the safety of the public. The AINS also incorporates and potentially funds H.R. 5486, Representative Guthrie and Matsui's SMART Act. As the demands on federal and shared spectrum increases, we will need to make smarter, more efficient use of these resources, and the SMART Act will help in that effort. Again, I thank my colleagues for all their work to advance these important bills. Together, it is a significant piece of legislation that will not only take the necessary steps to make spectrum available for commercial use, but also fund critical public safety programs. I want to acknowledge and thank FCC Chairman Rosenworcel for her leadership on this issue also. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I urge all of my colleagues—
Doyle, can I issue to yield to me?
Yes, I would urge all my colleagues to support this amendment, and I will yield to the chairman.
Thank you. Rather than take up the time of my own, if I could just use your 2 minutes. I do want to say that I think these are collectively, this is an important measure. Last month, the subcommittee marked up the legislation to make more mid-band spectrum available for auction, extend the FCC's auction authority, and improve spectrum sharing, among other things. And 2 of these bills have been incorporated into the AINS before us, and that's the H.R. 7783, the Extending America's Spectrum Auction Leadership Act, and H.R. 5486, the SMART Act. And I think that collectively, these measures will generate billions of dollars in spectrum auction proceeds to fund important and overdue policy priorities in a way that is budget neutral, as our ranking member of the full committee said. Under the Spectrum Innovation Act, spectrum auction proceeds will provide the FCC with additional funds for the Secure and Trusted Networks Reimbursement Program so that untrusted equipment and services are removed from our networks. The bill would then direct auction proceeds up to $10 billion to fund the newly authorized Next Generation 911 grant program to upgrade our country's emergency communication centers. And in my view, the funds generated by this bill for Next Generation 911 should be considered as an initial down payment for the program. So again, I want to thank Chairman Doyle, Ranking Members Rogers and Latta for the work on this bill and the amendments, and also thank our FCC Chairwoman Rosenworcel for her advocacy and leadership on this issue, which has helped us get to this point today, and urge my colleagues to support the AINS and the underlying bill. And I yield back to Chairman Doyle.
And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Now recognize our Ranking Member Rogers for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to all the members, but especially the leadership of Mr. Latta and Mr. Doyle. I want to say thank you, applaud the work that's been done on this bipartisan amendment. Moving forward, H.R. 7624, the Spectrum Innovation Act. This amendment builds on the bipartisan work from the subcommittee marked by advancing long-standing committee priorities while putting money back into the Treasury from future spectrum auction proceeds. There are several communications priorities included in this legislation, from protecting national security and public safety to encouraging more efficient use of our airways. This is how we win the future, by coming together to solve our nation's challenges in this committee room under regular order with input from members up and down the dais. I'm pleased to see Mr. Guthrie's Smart Spectrum Act has been included in this amendment. At the subcommittee markup, I urged inclusion of this language, which would provide NTIA another tool to efficiently manage federal spectrum by establishing an incumbent informing capability to help make more spectrum available for commercial use. As the demand for wireless technology grows, we must continue to look for innovative ways to make spectrum available to keep up with technology. I'm also pleased to see the bipartisan 18-month extension of FCC authority, auction authority included. This legislation is critical for allowing the FCC to continue its work advancing 5G and wireless deployment. Without this legislation, the FCC's current auction authority will expire on September 30th, 2022. This is currently the only proposal in Congress to extend the authority. And I want to thank my colleagues for working collaboratively to move this forward. I understand there's some budget discussions still occurring, and I look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues to ensure this legislation is budget neutral when it comes to the floor. Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for working on this legislation with us, and I yield back. Oh, I yield to Mr. Johnson. Sorry about that, Mr. Johnson.
I thank the gentlewoman for yielding. Mr. Chairman, I express my strong support for H.R. 7624, the Spectrum Innovation Act. Not only would this bipartisan legislation make additional mid-band spectrum available for commercial use, but the amendment in the nature of a substitute also includes legislation that I'm proud to co-lead, H.R. 7783, the Extending America's Spectrum Auction Leadership Act. This bill would prevent the FCC's auction authority from expiring in September by extending it for another 18 months. It is critical that Congress act to ensure the Commission maintains its authority to auction spectrum bandwidth. As we know, spectrum auctions are an important revenue generator and have been used to fund other telecommunications priorities. It's also vitally important that the FCC moves forward with the planned auction of the 2.5 gigahertz band, which is set to take place later this month. This spectrum auction will enable providers access to prime spectrum for 5G, particularly important for rural areas like where I represent. I encourage my colleagues to support the Ains Amendment to H.R. 7624, and I too yield back the balance of my time.
So gentlewoman yields?
I yield back.
Yield back?
Yes.
Thank you. Next, we'll recognize Chairwoman Eshoo for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. Obviously, I'm pleased, and I stated this in an opening statement, I'm pleased that today's markup will finally make progress on the much-needed legislation to bring our nation's 911 services into the 21st century. The Spectrum Innovation Act includes legislation that I introduced in the last Congress to establish a new federal grant program to help fund the nationwide adoption of Next-Gen 911. This grant program will provide $10 billion in proceeds from the mid-band spectrum auction to fund the nationwide adoption of Next-Gen 911, or shorthand now will be Ng911. This is a lifeline for Americans in their greatest hours of need. In an emergency, few things are more important than these three numbers. I know many of us as parents taught our children at a very young age, if something bad has happened, you need to know this number that you can dial and get help from. And it can often be the difference between life and death. The Ng911 technology will allow our 911 emergency communication centers to receive real-time location information. That means text messages, pictures, and video from individuals at the scene of an emergency and share that information with first responders. So this means if someone were to break into your home and you're trying to hide from the intruder, you don't need to call 911 to talk to an operator and potentially alert the intruder to where you are in the house. Instead, you can simply text 911 to get help while you continue to hide in silence. This also means sending pictures or live streaming video from the scene of a car accident or, God forbid, a home fire to help first responders better respond to an emergency. It means harnessing the power of the 21st century and its technology to respond to 21st century emergencies. This is also going to make our emergency communication centers more secure, more resilient, interoperable, and reliable. I co-founded the Ng911 caucus with Congressman John Shimkus, and at that time, Senators Conrad Burns and Hillary Clinton in 2003. That was in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. And we did this to support first responders and the public safety community by modernizing our emergency networks and supporting the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission to ensure that first responders would have interoperable communications. 2003, now it's 2022. So 18 years after founding that caucus, I think that, and I think you would all agree, that we had fallen short of our goal. Most 911 call centers still using the same legacy technology that was in place when the first 911 call was made over 50 years ago. We all know this is unacceptable. The good news is we're doing something about it today. The provisions in the Spectrum Innovation Act represent a new version of the Ng911 legislation I introduced in the last Congress, and it's been fine-tuned over the last 2 years to reach a compromise with our Republican colleagues and stakeholders in the first responder community. So while I'm pleased that this agreement allows for up to $10 billion with a B to be used for Ng911, it's important to note that according to cost estimates, the true cost of nationwide Ng911 adoption is closer to $15 billion. But $10 billion is more than a hell of a start. So I want to thank Congressman Richard Hudson, who is the co-chair with me of the Ng911 caucus, and his wonderful staff for working with us on this legislation. I want to thank all of my colleagues for the support that I know you're going to give to this. This is going to make such a difference across our country and in all of the communities through your communication centers. So I urge everyone to vote for this, and yield it back.
Thank you, Chairwoman Eshoo. I believe, is there anyone on the Republican side? Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
I appreciate the committee's work on this legislation before us. Making spectrum resources available is crucial to expanding wireless connectivity across the United States. And the reality is that consumers and businesses alike rely on mobile connectivity for school, work, entertainment, and public safety. Making more spectrum available to both satellite systems and wireless carriers in rural areas helps meet these needs. After Hurricane Michael made landfall in my district in 2018, we faced a large rebuilding phase. And with all new 5G infrastructure and additional mid-band spectrum assets deployed to meet our consumer demands, The Florida Panhandle became one of the first regions to realize the benefit of this new service. However, the work is not complete. As Congressman to Florida's rural 2nd District, I look forward to working with my colleagues to improve and expand these networks for consumers across America. Finally, as an important matter of national security, funding the Secure and Trusted Networks Reimbursement Program, also known as RIP and Replace, is critical to getting Huawei and ZTE equipment out of our communications networks. This is something that I have discussed at length in my role as on the China Task Force, and it should be a priority for this committee. And I thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Florida. We share a lot of those same concerns in New Jersey with the hurricanes. I believe Ms. Matsui is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
I join Chairman Doyle in introducing the Spectrum Innovation Act to ensure that we're making available as much spectrum as possible for commercial use while also recognizing the needs of our federal users. The amendment before us today lays out a balanced approach for freeing up much-needed mid-band spectrum in the lower 3 gigahertz band and asserting a clear commitment to winning the race for 5G and beyond. And by establishing the Public Safety and Secure Networks Fund, this amendment provides a framework for funding some of our most pressing communications needs. As an original co-sponsor of the RIP and Replace legislation, I'm glad that we're making good on the bipartisan congressional goal of replacing vulnerable network equipment through the United States. In April, I led a letter with Congressman Guthrie that was signed by 20 members calling for this funding to address a significant shortfall in the program. Congress voted to replace all, not most, of this equipment, and the chairman's amendment will ensure that that goal is realized. Importantly, this amendment also sets up a pathway to fund the SMART Act Congressman Guthrie and I have been working on together. By supporting the development of an incumbent informing capability, we provide NTIA with another tool to manage the federal spectrum footprint while creating new opportunities to make spectrum available for commercial use. By coordinating between federal agencies and with private partners, the government can be more efficient with the spectrum it has and create the framework we need to give more commercial users valuable access to this limited resource. And finally, I'm glad to see we're taking another step forward to extending the FCC's auction authority. This authority has never lapsed, and this amendment is another demonstration of the bipartisan will to keep that record unbroken. I urge my colleagues to support this aims and yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Thank the gentlewoman. Unless someone wants to speak, I'd like to try to finish this bill before we recess because they called the votes on the floor. So let's proceed to the, is that all right for everyone? We'll proceed to the vote on the Ains, which I believe is going to be a voice vote. If there's no further debate, we'll proceed to a vote on the amendment. All those in favor of the Ains will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The Ains is agreed to. There are no further amendments, so we're going to go to a vote on, I think you want a recorded vote on this one, right? So we'll go to a recorded vote on final passage of 7624. Those in favor of reporting HR 7624 as amended to the House will say aye. Those opposed will say no, and the clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Rush.
Rush votes aye.
Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshoo.
Aye.
Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Mr. Doyle.
Yes.
Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Mr. Butterfield.
Try this again. Schakowsky of Illinois, can you see me? Votes aye.
Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Ms. Matsui.
Matsui votes aye.
Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Castor. Mr. Sarbanes.
Votes aye.
Mr. Sarbanes votes aye. Mr. McNerney.
Rooney votes aye.
Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Tonko.
Tonko of New York votes aye.
Mr. Tonko votes aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Cardenas.
Cardenas representing California votes aye.
Mr. Cardenas votes aye. Mr. Ruiz.
Ruiz votes aye.
Mr. Ruiz votes aye. Mr. Peters.
Peters votes aye.
Mr. Peters votes aye. Mrs. Dingell. Mrs. Dingell votes aye. Mr. Vesey. Mr. Vesey votes aye. Ms. Custer.
Custer votes aye.
Ms. Custer votes aye. Ms. Kelly. Ms. Badagan.
Badagan votes aye.
Ms. Badagan votes aye. Mr. McEachin.
McEachin votes aye.
Mr. McEachin votes aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester.
Blunt Rochester of Delaware votes aye.
Ms. Blunt Rochester votes aye. Mr. Soto. Mr. O'Halloran.
O'Halloran votes aye.
Mr. O'Halloran votes aye. Ms. Rice.
New York votes aye.
Ms. Rice votes aye. Ms. Craig.
Ms. Craig votes aye.
Ms. Craig votes aye. Ms. Schreier.
Schreier votes aye.
Ms. Schreier votes aye. Ms. Trahan.
And votes aye.
Ms. Trahan votes aye. Ms. Fletcher. Mrs. Rogers.
Aye.
Mrs. Rogers votes aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long.
Aye.
Mr. Long votes aye. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes aye. Mr. Mullen.
Aye.
Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Carter.
Carter from Georgia votes aye.
Mr. Carter votes aye. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan votes aye. Mr. Palmer. Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Dunn. Mr. Dunn votes aye. Mr. Curtis. Ms. Lesko. Ms. Lesko votes aye. Mr. Pence. Mr. Pence votes aye. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce votes aye. Mr. Armstrong. Mr. Armstrong votes aye. Chairman Pallone.
Pallone of New Jersey votes aye.
Chairman Pallone votes aye.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, anyone who's not recorded?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
How is Mr. Curtis recorded?
Mr. Curtis is not recorded.
Curtis votes aye.
Mr. Curtis votes aye.
Ms.
Mr.
DeGette?
Chairman, DeGette votes aye.
Ms. DeGette votes aye.
Mr. Welch?
Mr. Welch votes aye.
Madam Clerk, Soto votes aye.
Mr. Soto votes aye.
Mr. Chairman, this is Lizzie
Yes.
Fletcher. How am I recorded?
Ms. Fletcher is not recorded.
Fletcher votes aye.
Ms. Fletcher votes aye.
Anyone else who's not recorded and wants to be? Okay. If not, the clerk will report the tally.
On that vote, the yeas were 52 and the nays were 0.
The vote is 52 ayes to 0 noes, and therefore H.R. 7624 as amended is reported to the full House. And we'll now stand in recess till after this last series of votes, and then please come back. Committee is in recess. The committee will reconvene, and we're going to start our second bill. The chair calls up H.R. 4275, the Ensuring Phone and Internet Access Through Lifeline and Affordable Connectivity Program Act of 2022, as forwarded by the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, and the clerk will report the bill.
Committee print to H.R. 4275, a bill to provide for certain
Madam Clerk,
reports.
without objection, the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Is any member seeking recognition to speak on H.R. 4275? Is that person here? I don't want to skip over. Who would? No one, no member wanted to speak on that one? Okay. So then we will go to, if there are any members seeking recognition to offer an amendment. No amendments. All right. So then we're going to go to a vote. Make it easy. Voice vote? I think it's recorded. Oh, recorded vote? Okay. All right, so that'll make it so everybody has to come back. A recorded vote is ordered. Oh, those aren't amendments. Okay. A recorded vote is ordered. Those in favor of reporting H.R. 4275 as amended to the House will say aye. Those opposed will say no, and the clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Rush. Ms. Eshoo.
Eshoo votes aye.
Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Ms. DeGette. Mr. Doyle. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Ms. Matsui.
Matsui votes aye.
Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Castor. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. McNerney.
McNerney votes aye.
Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Welch. Mr. Tonko.
Tonko of New York votes aye.
Mr. Tonko votes aye. Ms. Clark. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Cardenas.
House representing California votes aye.
Mr. Cardenas votes aye. Mr. Ruiz. Mr. Peters. Mrs. Dingell. Mrs. Dingell votes aye. Mr. Vesey. Ms. Custer.
Custer votes aye.
Ms. Custer votes aye. Ms. Kelly. Ms. Barragan.
Barragan votes aye.
Ms. Barragan votes aye. Mr. McEachin.
McEachin votes aye.
Mr. McEachin votes aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester.
Blunt Rochester votes aye.
Ms. Blunt Rochester votes aye. Mr. Soto. Mr. O'Halloran. Ms. Rice.
Rice from New York votes aye.
Ms. Rice votes aye. Ms. Craig. Ms. Schreier.
Schreier votes aye.
Ms. Schreier votes aye. Ms. Strahan.
Strahan votes aye.
Ms. Strahan votes aye. Ms. Fletcher.
Fletcher votes aye.
Ms. Fletcher votes aye. Mrs. Rogers. Mrs. Rogers votes aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes aye. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes aye. Mr. Mullen.
Aye.
Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Palmer. Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Dunn. Mr. Dunn. Mr. Dunn votes aye. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Curtis votes aye. Ms. Lesko. Ms. Lesko votes aye. Mr. Pence. Mr. Pence votes aye. Mr. Crenshaw.
Crenshaw votes aye.
Mr. Crenshaw, can you please repeat your vote? I couldn't see you on camera.
Crenshaw votes aye.
Mr. Crenshaw votes aye. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce votes aye. Mr. Armstrong. Mr. Armstrong votes aye. Chairman Pallone.
Pallone from New Jersey votes aye.
Chairman Pallone votes aye.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
How's the gentleman recorded?
Mr. Doyle, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. You are not recorded.
Doyle votes yes.
Mr. Doyle votes aye.
Mr. Chairman, how is Sarbanes recorded?
Mr. Sarbanes is not recorded.
Sarbanes votes.
Mr. Chairman, how's Rui?
Mr. Duncan, I think, had his hand up.
Mr. Sarbanes, I couldn't hear your vote. Can you please repeat it?
Sarbanes votes aye.
Mr. Sarbanes votes aye.
Mr. Duncan?
Ruiz? Aye.
Mr. Duncan is not recorded. Mr. Duncan votes aye.
Mr. Ruiz?
Mr. Ruiz is not recorded.
Ruiz votes aye.
Mr. Ruiz votes aye.
Mr. Hudson?
Mr. Hudson is not recorded, and Mr. Rush is not recorded.
Hudson votes aye.
Mr. Hudson votes
Mr.
aye.
Chairman.
Mr. Rush?
Mr. Rush votes aye.
recorded?
All right, everybody just relax a little here. We have a lot of...
Oh, okay.
All right, Mr. Rush, you have?
Aye.
Mr. Rush votes aye.
Next. Who's next?
Robin Kelly?
Ms. Kelly is not recorded.
Ms. Kelly?
Kelly votes aye.
Ms. Kelly votes aye.
Ms. Castor?
Ms. Castor,
Florida votes aye.
Ms. Castor votes aye.
Mr. Peters?
Mr. Peters is not recorded.
Mr.
Peters
Peters?
votes aye.
Mr. Peters votes aye.
Mr. Soto?
Mr. Soto is not recorded.
Soto votes aye.
Mr. Soto votes aye.
Ms. DeGette?
Ms. DeGette is not recorded.
aye. Oh, DeGette votes aye.
Ms. DeGette votes aye.
Ms. Craig?
Ms. Craig?
Ms. Craig is not recorded.
Ms. Craig votes aye.
Ms. Craig votes aye.
Anyone else who's not recorded and wants to be recorded? Should we wait or we're ready?
Guthrie's on his way. Could I ask for those that aren't recorded?
On the minority side,
Yes, please.
Mr. Upton is not recorded. Mr. Burgess, Mr. Scalise, Mr. Guthrie, Mr. Kinzinger, and Mr. Carter.
We could wait a couple minutes. Let's just wait a couple minutes because there are quite a few.
Acknowledge it.
Mr. Guthrie is not recorded.
They didn't say whether recorded.
Mr. Guthrie votes aye.
Anyone else? I think we're okay. We're already...
Am I recorded? This is Mark Wayne. Mullen.
Mr. Mullen?
Mr. Mullen is recorded as aye.
Thank you.
Anyone else? All right. Madam Clerk, could you report the tally? He voted, didn't he?
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the yeas were 48 and the nays were 0.
So the vote is 48 ayes to 0 noes, and HR 4275 is reported, is it amended? As amended. HR 4275 as amended is reported to the House. All right, we'll go to the next bill. The chair calls up HR 4990, the Institute for Telecommunication Sciences Codification Act, or the ITS Codification Act, as forwarded by the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, and the clerk will report the bill.
Committee print for HR 4990 to codify the Institute for
And Madam Clerk, without objection, the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read, and without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment. Are there any members seeking recognition to speak on HR 4990? All right, doesn't look like anybody wants to speak. Mr. Carter?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Carter, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I rise to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Okay, this is 4990, isn't it?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you and Ranking Member McMorris Rogers for calling up my legislation, HR 4990, the ITS Codification Act. I would like to again thank Mr. O'Hallahan for offering his amendment in the nature of a substitute during our subcommittee markup a few weeks ago, which makes only minor technical corrections to the underlying legislation. This bill, which has bipartisan support, is the research and engineering will work to provide the needed statutory authority for the Institute for Telecommunication Sciences. As we know, ITS is a research and engineering laboratory that supports the National Telecommunications and Information Administration's mission to manage radio frequency spectrum. With the enactment of this legislation, ITS will also be required to further develop emergency communication and tracking technologies in our country. Through this action, NITA will make progress in locating and rescuing individuals who are trapped in confined spaces who are not otherwise able to carry out conventional radio communication. As a healthcare professional, I know how every moment counts when it comes to getting a person out of these situations and returning them to their family. Therefore, the ITS Codification Act is a bill to help the American people. By codifying the Institute for Telecommunication Sciences, we will open the door for advancement in wireless technology. I would ask all of my colleagues to fully support this legislation, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank the gentleman. Does anyone else want to speak on this bill? Okay. Does anyone want to offer an amendment? Doesn't appear to be the case. Recorded vote? All right, we'll have a recorded vote on the bill. A recorded vote is ordered. Those in favor of reporting HR 4990 as amended to the House will say aye. Those opposed will say no, and the clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Rush.
Vote aye.
Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eschew.
Eschew votes aye.
Ms. Eschew votes aye. Ms. DeGette.
DeGette votes aye.
Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mr. Doyle.
Doyle votes yes.
Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky. Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Ms. Matsui.
Matsui votes aye.
Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Castor.
Ms. Castor of Florida votes aye.
Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. McNerney?
McNerney votes aye.
Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Welch? Mr. Tonko?
Tonko of New York votes aye.
Mr. Tonko votes aye. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Schrader? Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Cardenas? Mr. Ruiz?
Ruiz votes aye.
Mr. Ruiz votes aye. Mr. Peters?
Peters votes aye.
Mr. Peters votes aye. Mrs. Dingell? Mrs. Dingell votes aye. Mr. Vesey? Mr. Vesey votes aye. Ms. Custer?
Custer votes aye.
Ms. Custer votes aye. Ms. Kelly?
Kelly votes aye.
Ms. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Bedregon?
Barragan votes aye.
Ms. Bedregon votes aye. Mr. McEachin?
McEachin votes aye.
Mr. McEachin votes aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester?
Blunt Rochester votes aye.
Ms. Blunt Rochester votes aye. Mr. Soto?
Soto votes aye.
Mr. Soto votes aye. Mr. O'Halloran? Ms. Rice?
Rice of New York votes aye.
Ms. Rice votes aye. Ms. Craig?
Ms. Craig of Minnesota votes aye.
Ms. Craig votes aye. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Trahan?
Trahan votes aye.
Ms. Trahan votes aye. Ms. Fletcher?
Fletcher votes aye.
Ms. Fletcher votes aye. Mrs. Rogers? Mrs. Rogers votes aye. Mr. Upton? Mr. Burgess? Mr. Scalise? Mr. Latta? Mr. Latta votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. McKinley? Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger? Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Bilirakis? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long? Mr. Long votes aye. Mr. Bouchon? Mr. Bouchon votes aye. Mr. Mullen?
Aye.
Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Hudson? Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Carter?
Carter from Georgia votes aye.
Mr. Carter votes aye. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Duncan votes aye. Mr. Palmer? Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Dunn? Mr. Dunn votes aye. Mr. Curtis? Ms. Lesko? Ms. Lesko votes aye. Mr. Pence? Mr. Pence votes aye. Mr. Crenshaw?
Crenshaw votes aye.
Mr. Crenshaw votes aye. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce votes aye. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Armstrong votes aye. Chairman Pallone?
Pallone from New Jersey votes aye.
Chairman Pallone votes aye.
Any members who haven't been recorded?
Votes aye.
Cardenas?
Cardenas?
Mr. Cardenas
Uh,
votes aye.
Mr. Welch of Vermont votes aye.
Schreier
Mr.
votes aye.
Mr. Welch votes aye. Ms. Schreier votes aye.
Anyone else who wishes to be recorded? Mr. Burgess?
Mr. Burgess votes aye.
Mr. Bilirakis?
Bilirakis votes aye.
Mr. Bilirakis votes aye.
Any other member who is not recorded and wishes to be recorded? All right. Madam Clerk will report the tally.
On that vote, the yeas were 51 and the nays were 0.
51. The vote is 51 ayes to 0 noes, and as a result, H.R. 4990, as amended, is reported to the full House. The next bill we have is H.R. 7132. The chair calls up H.R. 7132. The Safe Connections Act of 2022 is forwarded by the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, and the clerk will report the bill.
Committee print to H.R. 7132, a bill to preserve safe access
Madam
to
Clerk, without
communications.
objection, the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read. And without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Are there any members seeking recognition to speak on H.R. 7132? Yes? Who's that? Oh, Ms. Custer is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I am so pleased to see this committee take up my bicameral, bipartisan legislation, the Safe Connections Act. An almost identical bill has already passed the Senate earlier this Congress, and I'm hopeful that we can get this across the finish line and to the President's desk before the year is out. As the founder and co-chair of the Bipartisan Task Force to End Sexual Violence, I've met with countless survivors of domestic and sexual abuse. For those who haven't experienced this kind of abuse, it can be easy to overlook just how difficult it is to escape these relationships. There's no single perfect solution to help survivors break free from the control of their abusers, but our task force has advanced a number of proposals over the years to help make the process easier. The Safe Connections Act is one of those bills. We've seen how abusers can leverage a shared or family phone plan to monitor, stalk, and control their victims. Survivors can also struggle to afford a phone plan of their own when they leave an abusive relationship in which they shared the plan. As survivors work to find safety and reestablish their finances after leaving their abusers, having a reliable cell phone is simply essential. The Safe Connections Act seeks to eliminate these challenges in several ways. First, the bill allows survivors to go to their phone carrier and separate themselves and their dependents from the shared plan without any fees or penalties. All they need is an affidavit from a medical or social worker or a copy of a police report. Second, it directs the Federal Communications Commission to examine how they can better help survivors without financial means smoothly enroll in the Lifeline program for 6 months, providing reliable phone service at a reduced price while they regain their financial stability. And lastly, but very importantly, it directs the FCC to make rules to ensure that calls or texts to domestic violence hotlines don't appear on the call logs of shared phone plans. If an abuser discovers these calls are being made, the survivor may be in grave danger. This holistic approach for mitigating challenges around shared phone plans will save lives. I was heartened to see the Communications and Technology Subcommittee advance the bill unanimously, and I hope the full committee will do likewise. I'm deeply grateful to the survivor advocacy organizations and the carrier companies who work together with us to find a workable strategy to address this problem. I want to give a shout out to Representative Eshoo and Representative Wahlberg for co-leading this bipartisan bill in the House, and to Senator Schatz for his leadership in the Senate. And my deepest thanks to the chairman, the ranking member, and their staffs, as well as Chairman Doyle and his staff, for working with us to include this critical bill in today's markup. I look forward to advancing it to the full House today. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Custer. I saw Mr. Wahlberg's hand is up. He's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased that the full committee is considering H.R. 7132, the Safe Connections Act. It's a bipartisan, bicameral legislation piece that is critical for survivors of domestic violence to gain independence and separate their cell phone lines from any plan shared with their abuser. I'm very proud to join my colleagues, Representative Eshoo and Custer, on this legislation. Survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, and human trafficking face many challenges when establishing independence from an abuser. This bill will eliminate one of those challenges and ensure that survivors are able to stay connected without having to deal with financial penalties or arduous paperwork. The Safe Connections Act boasts support from the wireless industry and survivors groups alike, And I'd like to thank our colleagues in the Senate, Senators Fisher and Schatz, for their many months of work to get this compromise. It strikes the right balance between ensuring easier separation processes for survivors while not causing undue burdens for businesses. Gaining independence from an abuser is difficult enough. A cell phone contract should not be another impediment to getting to safety. I encourage all of my colleagues to support the bill, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wahlberg. I believe Ms. Eshu's hand was up. Maybe not.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlewoman's
I wanna
recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Annie Custer, Congresswoman Custer, for her leadership on this important bill. And I'm really proud to have partnered with her and Congressman Wahlberg on it. At our hearing in the Communication and Technology Subcommittee last month, I talked about the dangers of shared plans for survivors of domestic abuse and how this legislation ensures that survivors can easily separate from their plans and still stay connected to their loved ones. The legislation passed 29-0 through the subcommittee. And I think the unanimous passage of this legislation really demonstrates the tremendous work that can be done, that we can do together to advance what are really nuanced solutions to modern day problems. The Safe Connections Act is going to address the unintended harms of shared phone plans. You hear the ads on TV for shared phone plans. I don't think very many of us would have the first thought come into our minds when we hear those advertisements about those that survive an abusive relationship and get strung up in these shared phone plans. So this is important, and I don't think I need to urge colleagues to vote for it. I think the legislation speaks for itself, but bravo to you, Annie, and to Mr. Walker, and I'm proud to be a part of this, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Eshu. Anybody on the Republican side? All right, then we'll go to Ms. Schakowsky.
Thank you. Just briefly, let me thank the co-sponsors, Representative Custer and Wahlberg, and all of those who have supported in the past. I just want to add a little bit of urgency to the issue that we're dealing with, because just yesterday, a report measuring gender-based violence in my hometown of the city of Chicago found that the number of domestic violence-related incidents have increased by 64% just last year. And of course, as has been pointed out, the separation from the victim and the perpetrator has been the real problem. And so finally, this bill will cut off often a overlooked but absolutely devastating tool, the phone the perpetrators use and abuse to continue to manipulate and terrorize and stalk and harm their the victims. So I am very happy to support this bill and very happy that it has the support it does. And I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Lesko is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
I'll be very brief. As a survivor of domestic violence from a previous marriage, I support this legislation, and I thank the sponsors for sponsoring it.
Thank you. Ms. Dingell?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
As a co-chair of the bipartisan working group to end domestic violence with my Republican colleague, Ms. Lesko, I we both are encouraged by our work today to curb domestic abuse and protect victims of domestic violence. Unfortunately, both of us know that fear of trying to use a phone and having the phone not work. We have more to do, but this legislation makes common sense changes that will have a profound impact on these individuals and their safety. The Safe Connections Act of 2022 will ensure that survivors have the essential communication tools they need by providing them an avenue to separate their wireless service plan from their abuser and not to be tracked. Shared plans can often be exploited to stalk or control victims of abuse, and there's so many stories we've heard and can share. These individuals must have the independence necessary to heal physically, mentally, and emotionally while remaining connected to vital support systems and programs and being able to call when they need help. This legislation is one step in accomplishing this goal. I want to thank my colleagues on this committee, the sponsor of this bill, everybody on this committee on both sides for working to protect the safety and stability of survivors and for getting this work done. And like others, I'm grateful. I know that most of the members of this committee, if not all, will support this legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Any member on either side want to speak further on this bill? All right. I don't believe we have any amendments. Recorded vote? Okay, we'll go to a recorded vote on final passage. A recorded vote is ordered. Those in favor of reporting HR 7132 as amended to the House will say aye. Those opposed will say no, and the clerk shall call the roll.
Mr. Rush.
Rush votes aye.
Mr. Rush votes aye. Ms. Eshoo.
Eshoo votes aye.
Ms. Eshoo votes aye. Ms. DeGette.
DeGette votes aye.
Ms. DeGette votes aye. Mr. Doyle.
Yes.
Mr. Doyle votes aye. Ms. Schakowsky.
Schakowsky votes aye.
Ms. Schakowsky votes aye. Mr. Butterfield. Ms. Matsui.
Matsui votes aye.
Ms. Matsui votes aye. Ms. Castor.
Ms. Castor of Florida votes aye.
Ms. Castor votes aye. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney votes aye. Mr. Welch.
Mr. Welch votes aye.
Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Tonko.
Tonko of New York votes aye.
Mr. Tonko votes aye. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark votes aye. Mr. Schrader. Mr. Schrader votes aye. Mr. Cardenas. Mr. Cardenas.
Cardenas, representing California, votes aye.
Mr. Cardenas votes aye. Mr. Ruiz.
Votes aye.
Mr. Ruiz votes aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes aye. Mrs. Dingell. Mrs. Dingell votes aye. Mr. Vesey. Mr. Vesey votes aye. Ms. Custer.
Custer votes aye.
Ms. Custer votes aye. Ms. Kelly.
Kelly votes aye.
Ms. Kelly votes aye. Ms. Barragan.
Barragan votes aye.
Ms. Barragan votes aye. Mr. McEachin.
McEachin votes aye.
Mr. McEachin votes aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester.
Blunt Rochester votes aye.
Ms. Blunt Rochester votes aye. Mr. Soto. Mr. O'Halloran. Ms. Rice.
Rice of New York votes aye.
Ms. Rice votes aye. Ms. Craig. Ms. Craig. Ms. Schreier.
Votes aye.
Ms. Schreier votes aye. Ms. Trahan.
Trahan votes aye.
Ms. Trahan votes aye. Ms. Fletcher. Mrs. Rogers. Mrs. Rogers votes aye. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mr. Scalise. Mr. Latta. Mr. Latta votes aye. Mr. Guthrie. Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. McKinley. Mr. McKinley votes aye. Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Griffith. Mr. Griffith votes aye. Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Bilirakis votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes aye. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon votes aye. Mr. Mullen.
Aye.
Mr. Mullen votes aye. Mr. Hudson. Mr. Hudson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Carter.
Carter from Georgia votes aye.
Mr. Carter votes aye. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan votes aye. Mr. Palmer. Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Dunn. Mr. Dunn votes aye. Mr. Curtis.
Curtis votes aye.
Mr. Curtis votes aye. Ms. Lesko. Ms. Lesko votes aye. Mr. Pence. Mr. Pence votes aye. Mr. Crenshaw. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce votes aye. Mr. Armstrong. Mr. Armstrong votes aye. Chairman Pallone.
Pallone, New Jersey votes aye.
Chairman Pallone votes aye.
Mr. Chairman, this is Lizzie Fletcher. How am I recorded?
Ms. Fletcher is not recorded.
Fletcher votes aye.
Ms. Fletcher votes aye.
Mr. Chairman, this is Mr. Soto. How am I recorded?
Mr. Soto is not recorded.
Soto votes aye.
Mr. Soto votes aye.
This is Miss Craig. How am I recorded?
Ms. Craig is not recorded.
Miss Craig from Minnesota votes aye.
Ms. Craig votes aye.
Any other members who are not recorded and wish to be? Is Mr. Ruiz recorded?
Mr. Ruiz is recorded as aye.
All right. Anyone else? If not, we'll.
I wish to be
Mr.
recorded.
Crenshaw?
Yes, I wish to be recorded. I vote aye.
Mr. Crenshaw votes aye.
Anyone else? All right. If not, the clerk will report the tally.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the yeas were 53 and the nays were 0.
Okay, so the vote is 53 ayes to 0 noes, and therefore H.R. 7132 as amended is reported to the full House. And we have, I think we just have one more bill. The chair calls up H.R. 3630, the Lymphedema Treatment Act, and the clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 3630, to amend Title 18 of the Social Security.
Madam Clerk, without objection, the first reading of the bill will be dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read, and without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment. Are there any members seeking recognition to speak on H.R. 3630? Ms. Schakowsky is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I move to strike the last word.
Recognized.
So I am really, really grateful to see the bipartisan support for the Lymphedema Treatment Act that we're going to move today. I want to thank all of the advocates, the stakeholders, and all of the members on both sides of the aisle who have stepped up to do this. This bill will make a long overdue technical correction to the Medicare statute, and it will finally eliminate the gap in Medicare coverage for people living with lymphedema and to ensure coverage by doctors for the compression garments that they need. Lymphedema is a very, very painful disease, condition that people have, and many people don't know that 2/3 of lymphedema cases are cancer-related. Many of you have seen people who have cancer who have a swollen arm, and that can be very, very painful, can be a real problem for them. And so this, this legislation actually makes a huge difference. You know, I've seen lymphedema patients and constituents and friends, and so I know how painful, but also how costly the treatment is. On top of struggling with cancer, there is no cure for lymphedema. So medical compression is the thing that people really need to get the kind of relief. And unfortunately, Medicare has been unable to cover these supplements, the compression things that they put on their arms, because they don't fit into any existing benefit category. So the Lymphedema Treatment Act will actually finally answer that call and make a big difference. You should also know that studies have estimated that Medicare would save about $1.5 billion over 10 years because of the decreased hospitalization and other prevention complications that cost real money. But more importantly, cancer survivors and others, lymphedema sufferers, would be able to finally get the relief that they need. Millions of Americans suffer. It's an estimated 3.5 million Americans suffer from lymphedema. So I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for their support of this bill and urge my colleagues to pass the Lymphedema Treatment Act out of committee and to the floor of the House. And with that,
Will the gentlewoman yield to me briefly? Will the gentlewoman yield?
Of course.
I just wanted to thank Chairwoman Schakowsky for her longstanding advocacy on this issue. I know this isn't just a senior issue, but I know she's been a longtime advocate for senior issues, and over 350 members, bipartisan, signed on in support of this bill. As she mentioned, there are definitely some gaps in coverage, particularly with regard to garments, and we do need legislative authority to cover these items. So this bill is going to ensure that patients with lymphedema have access to the full range of treatments that they need, and I urge its passage and yield back to the gentlewoman.
And I yield back. But I do have an amendment at the desk.
Okay, thank you. Do we have
Chairman?
others? Is there anybody on the
Yes,
Republican
Mr. Chairman,
side?
this is Kim.
Mr. Guthrie, and then we'll go to Dr. Schreier. Mr. Guthrie is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll be brief, and gosh, I remember meeting with a sufferer of this, and it has touched all of us. And that's, it's grassroots people coming to Washington to make a difference in their lives. That's what we should respond to and react to, and we are today, and I appreciate that, and I'm committed to moving this bill forward today. But I just want to note, as we do close the gap, which there is a gap there that needs to be closed, it does create a new mandatory category in mandatory spending. And for a couple of things, one, new mandatory federal spending contributes to our deficit if it's not offset. The other thing is it could, Medicare beneficiaries may have to absorb the cost if it's not offset. And our Medicare program is already facing some insolvency issues, so if this is an offset. So 100% support. I've seen the instances of this as well. I think we all are and been moved by the people who've come to see us. So Mr. Chair, I just wanted to ask if you'll commit with working with me, because I want to move this forward today, but I just want to ensure we're committed before this comes to the floor for a full vote, that we will work to make sure this is offset spending.
If the gentleman will yield to me,
yield.
I assure him that we will do that as we always do before we go to the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that.
Is the gentleman?
Would the gentleman yield?
Unless anybody needs my time,
Would the gentleman yield?
I'll yield.
Who seeks
Who's
time?
seeking?
Oh,
Dr. Joyce.
Dr.
I yield to
Joyce.
Dr. Joyce.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I do want to offer my support for H.R. 3630, the Lymphedema Treatment Act, which I am one of the multiple co-sponsors. This bill is about closing a loophole that is restricting access to full care for the nearly 3 million Medicare beneficiaries suffering from lymphedema. Not having the necessary treatments covered by Medicare is something that impacts a patient's quality of life. And I'm glad to see that we're taking the necessary steps to rectify this incredibly important issue to these individuals. As a physician who has treated patients with lymphedema, working with occupational therapists, physical therapists, other physicians, I can attest firsthand to the necessity of the treatments that will be covered in this bill going forward and urge support for this legislation. I too understand that we will have more work to do on a budgetary offset and look forward to seeing this bill on the House floor shortly. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I believe we have Dr. Schreier next, who would like to speak on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
I just want to take a moment to, thank you. I just want to take a moment to recognize and remember one of the driving forces behind the Lymphedema Treatment Act, a Washingtonian, Elaine Eigenman. And we would not be here today passing this bill without the tenacity of Elaine. She lived with lymphedema for 20 years as a result of breast cancer treatment in 1999. And after her diagnosis, she chose to make a difference for other lymphedema patients. She built a whole community of patient advocates in Washington State and across the country as the board chair of the National Lymphedema Advocacy Group. Until her final days, Elaine advocated for the Lymphedema Treatment Act, educating me, a brand new member of Congress at the time, about the bill. So today, as we pass this bipartisan bill out of committee, let's remember Elaine and honor the work of all the advocates, particularly those who have shared their stories with me, Lynn, Kathy, Lisa, and Barbara, who have worked so hard to make this happen. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the gentlewoman. Anyone else on the Republican side? Mr. Carter? We're going to still, all right, here he comes.
There he is.
Mr. Carter? Don't run, we don't want to lose you. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, today we're taking a critical step to provide life-saving care to millions of Americans. I'm the lead Republican on this bill to help lymphedema patients get the prescription compression garments they need to stay healthy. There is no cure for lymphedema and no pharmaceutical treatment. Prescription medical compression garments are the long-established standard of care for treating lymphedema. But Medicare is currently unable to provide coverage for these vital supplies due to a lack of benefit category. There are an estimated 5 million Americans with lymphedema, and the majority of whom are cancer survivors. As a healthcare professional and co-chair Cancer Survivors Caucus, I came to Washington to make a difference and help those who are suffering. This bill takes a critical step to ensuring our most vulnerable patients have access to the care they need. The Lymphedema Treatment Act is one of the most bipartisan bills in Congress by a large margin. As has been noted, it has over 350 co-sponsors in the House and over 70 co-sponsors in the Senate. This is an example of something we can accomplish together in a bipartisan manner, and I want to thank Representative Schakowsky for her work on this and for allowing me to participate as well. I look forward to working with this committee on offsetting the spending in this legislation, as was pointed out by Representative Guthrie, and I thank him for that. Thank you again, Chairman Pallone and Leader Rogers, for including the Lymphedema Treatment Act in today's markup. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Custer is recognized for 5 minutes.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to co-sponsor H.R. 3630, the Lymphedema Treatment Act, the important legislation that will finally allow Medicare to cover compression garments to treat lymphedema, helping patients manage the swelling and pain associated with this chronic condition. I heard from constituents like Patty from Ware, New Hampshire, who has lymphedema as a result of a previous cancer diagnosis, about the importance of these treatments. Patty has struggled with lymphedema for years, resulting in the amputation of several toes on her left foot. She relies on active treatments such as physical therapy and compression supplies, which are both covered by her current insurance. Well, today her treatment is covered. Patty turns 65 next year, and she worries about how she will treat her lymphedema as a Medicare beneficiary. I also heard from Linda of Salem, New Hampshire, who's lived with lymphedema since her childhood. At 73 years old, she explained how more expensive treatments like hospitalization, visiting nurses, antibiotics for infection, sequential pumping machines, and the list goes on, are all covered by Medicare, and yet compression, the cornerstone of all lymphedema management, has not been covered. She asked that I share her story to make a difference to the millions of Americans living with lymphedema. The Lymphedema Treatment Act will empower patients like Patty and Linda to access necessary medical care, and I urge my colleagues to support the bill. I thank Chairman Pallone for advancing this legislation, and I yield back.
Thank the gentlewoman. Does anyone else want to speak? I know we have an amendment. Ms. Schakowsky, we'll move to your amendment. Ms. Schakowsky
Yes.
is offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute, and the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3630, offered by Ms. Schakowsky.
And without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with, and the gentlewoman from Illinois is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I wanted first to put into the record a letter from the, this is from the U.S. The U.S. Cancer Society, the American Cancer Society, and the Cancer Action Network. That's one letter that I'd like in the record. I wanted to just say something about what
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Just a couple things about the amendment. It finally does what we need to do. It changes the date of effectiveness to 2024 and inserts payment language that is so necessary that we've talked about. So essentially, this is really a technical addition that is going to make all the difference in the world to so many people, millions of Americans. And with that, I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to speak on the Ains? All right. We have no other amendments, right? Okay, then we'll go to voice vote on the Ains. Okay. All those in favor of the Schakowsky? Okay, all those in favor of the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3630 as introduced by the gentleman from Illinois will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. And so now we'll go to a recorded vote on, no? On final. We're going to have a voice vote on final. So the question now occurs on favorably reporting H.R. 3630 as amended to the House. All those in favor of reporting H.R. 3630 as amended will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and H.R. 3630 as amended is reported to the full House. I believe that concludes, but we have some letters, so I'll ask unanimous consent to enter the following documents into the record: a letter from the Electronic Frontier Foundation and a letter from the Oncology Nursing Society on H.R. 3630. Without objection, so ordered. All right. Thank you all for another bipartisan markup. Thank the ranking member and all the members on both sides. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the committee prints consistent with the actions taken by the committee today. Is there any further business? If not, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you all.